4 brothers, 5 territories, 3 years. The Savannah does not record this kind of arithmetic often, and when it does, the grass remembers the weight of it long after the animals have gone. The record here is not written in ink. It is written in displaced prides, in orphaned cubs, in the low-frequency roar that carries over 2 miles of open ground and makes every other male on the boundary stop eating at the same moment. The 4 came from nothing, from the anonymous edge of a territory where they were not counted by any dominant male. Then the counting stopped mattering. A lion coalition of 2 is common. 2 brothers, or an unrelated pair, will leave their birth pride together, move through the margins, and try to claim a single piece of ground before their strength fades. A coalition of 4 is something else entirely, and the studies that have watched them cross decades agree on one behavioral fact. The arithmetic of cooperation changes everything about what a male lion can hold. 4 brothers means 1 patrols, while 3 rest. 4 brothers means a scent mark laid every few hundred yards along a boundary that no single male could walk in a day. 4 brothers means that when a rival coalition arrives with 2 males, it does not arrive with a fight. It arrives with a decision already made, and the decision is usually to turn around. The title of this record is simple, and the Savannah confirmed it. 4 males, born from the same litter, moved out of their birthplace in the dry season and spent 3 years redrawing the map of their region. 5 territories changed hands. 5 prides came under new male control. And the old order, the one that had held for years, did not survive the arithmetic. No one saw the first move coming because the first move was not a move at all. It was patience. In the early months, the 4 did not confront a single dominant male. They hunted together, fed together, and stayed within a day's walk of each other, learning the terrain in a way that no coalition of 2 ever has the numbers to attempt. Here is where the observer must slow down. Watch them on any given morning and the coordination is visible in the smallest details. When they move in a loose formation, spread out enough that the grass hides them, close enough that a single low call brings them together. They do not walk like 4 animals. They walk like 1 animal with 4 points of attention. The marginal lands where they started were poor. Thin prey, contested water, the constant risk of an encounter with an established coalition patrolling its boundary. Young males die in this phase more often than in any other. The statistics are not recorded in any precise table the watcher can cite, but the pattern is known. This is the corridor where most male lions do not arrive. The 4 avoided those encounters. That avoidance was not cowardice, and the distinction matters. They were not running from the established order. They were mapping it, recording its patrol schedules with the same discipline an observer uses to record theirs. By the end of the first year, they had grown, not just in size, though the constant hunting built muscle across all 4 frames. They had grown in their understanding of the ground. They knew where each neighboring coalition liked to mark. They knew which boundaries were rarely walked. They knew which prides had been weakened by a recent turnover, which territories were held by an aging male clinging to the last of his strength. And then the patience ended. Not suddenly, not with a dramatic charge across an open plain. It ended with a single decision, made silently and executed as one, to cross a boundary that none of them had ever crossed before. The old male on that first territory was alone. He had held the pride for several seasons, long enough that his presence seemed permanent, long enough that the neighboring coalitions had learned to treat his boundary as fixed. The 4 did not give him a warning. They did not announce themselves with roars. They simply appeared one evening at the edge of his territory, 4 sets of eyes watching the pride from the tall grass. And the old male understood in that instant what his age had made him unable to prevent. He fought. That is what the record shows, and it is worth dwelling on because it was the last time he would ever fight anything. He came out of the grass alone, roaring, and the 4 did not scatter. They did what coalitions do when they outnumber a rival. They encircled. The old male found himself facing 1 brother, then 2, then a 3rd, cutting off his retreat, while the 4th held position near the pride. The fight did not last long. It rarely does when the numbers are that unequal. The old male was driven from the territory he had guarded for years, bleeding from a wound along his flank, and he did not come back. The record does not say where he went. Male lions driven out of their territory do not usually survive long, and the grass does not keep a log of their endings. The pride did not resist. The females had seen the fight from a distance, had watched the old male fall, and they understood the arithmetic of lions better than any observer ever will. Within days, the four had taken over the pride, and the first territory was theirs. The old male's final fight is the first boundary that changed hands in this record. 4 shapes closed, 1 retreat, and then a silence the record does not fill. Subscribe to follow the record past this first territory into the spaces that usually stay unrecorded. Leave the word encircled in the comments if this sequence held your attention. The record does not stop where the usual story does. This is where the narrative usually stops in a single male story. 1 territory, 1 pride, a few years of tenure, a slow decline. The 4 did not stop. And that is the observation that makes this record different. The second territory fell within the same season. It was held by a coalition of 2, brothers themselves, and they came out to meet the 4 with the confidence of animals that had never been outnumbered. That confidence lasted exactly as long as it took them to count the shapes emerging from the grass. There were 4. They were not spread thin across a boundary. They were together, and they moved together, and the 2 brothers looked at each other once and made the choice that 4 does not always allow. They ran. The record is clear on this. They abandoned the territory, abandoned the pride, abandoned every scent mark they had laid over years of patrol. The 4 did not need to fight. They walked into the second territory behind the retreating shapes, and the ground they had just claimed was larger than their first by a significant measure. The pattern was establishing itself. 2 territories, 2 prides, a growing range that already exceeded what any coalition of 2 could patrol. The 4 responded by not responding in the usual way. Instead of choosing 1 territory to defend, they began to move between both. They split into pairs, patrolling the borders of the first, while the others held the center of the second. The water point at the center of their growing range became the hub. Every few days, all 4 would gather there, drinking together, resting together, and observers began to notice a peculiar detail. The 4 did not squabble over the kills they made. At a single kill, a coalition of 2 will often argue over the carcass. The 4 ate in sequence, waiting their turn without any sign of competition, and that discipline was part of what made them impossible to dislodge. By the end of the second year, they had taken a 3rd territory. This one was held by a single aging male, and the pattern repeated with a grim efficiency. The 4 appeared at the boundary. The old male came out to meet them. The old male was driven away. The pride remained, and the 4 added its females to the network they were building. 3 territories, 3 prides. The range they now controlled spanned a distance that required days to cross, and the 4 had begun to split their time across all 3. The observers watching them had a term for what they were seeing, and it was not the usual language of lion coalitions. They called it an empire, and the word did not feel exaggerated. The burden of holding it, however, had begun to show. The 4 were constantly moving. They could not rest in one place for more than a day or 2 before a boundary needed walking or a threat needed checking. The weight that had been muscle in their first year had begun to turn toward a different kind of condition, the lean, hardened frame of animals that never quite stopped moving. Their faces carried the evidence of their success: torn ears, scars across the muzzle, the thickened skin of the brow that comes from years of impact. The 4 had fought for every territory they held, and the maps of those fights were written permanently into their bodies. Here is something the observers noticed that does not fit the usual narrative of male lion aggression. The 4 did not kill every male they encountered. When a rival coalition fled without engaging, the 4 did not pursue. When a single male was driven off an unclaimed edge of territory, they let him go. This was not mercy, and it would be sentimental to call it that. It was efficiency. Every fight cost them something, every wound took time to heal. And the 4 were beginning to understand that their real enemy was not any single rival, but the sheer scale of the ground they had claimed. The scale demanded more of them than any of them had anticipated. Patrol routes now stretched across distances that took 2 full days to cover. The 4 had to choose between keeping the whole range defended and keeping themselves healthy, and they were making that choice by never quite doing either completely. The cracks were beginning to show by the time they approached the 4th territory. Not cracks in their unity, which remained absolute. Cracks in their capacity. The 4 could still move together when the fight demanded it, but they moved with a visible cost now, and the cost was accumulating. The grass beside their patrol trails showed it, in the deeper impressions left by paws that carried more weight than they had carried a year before. The fourth territory was the most heavily contested they had attempted. It was held by a coalition of 3 brothers as well. And this coalition had seen the 4 coming from a distance. They had sworn their own alliance in response, and when the 4 arrived at the boundary, they found the 3 waiting in formation, side by side, snarling in the afternoon heat. The fight that followed was the longest of the campaign. It lasted through a full afternoon and into the evening, a rolling confrontation that crossed half the territory before either side gave ground. The 4 fought as they always had, encircling, cutting off retreat, using their numbers to isolate their opponents one at a time. The 3 fought with the desperation of animals that knew what losing would cost them. In the end, the numbers decided it. The 3 were driven out, wounded, and the 4th territory was added to the map. But the 4 had paid for it. One brother carried a gash along his shoulder that would take weeks to close. Another moved with a limp that did not fully heal. The record notes that they rested for 3 days at the new water point before attempting any patrol at all, and the rest itself was evidence of the cost. 4 territories. The range now covered an area that no coalition of this size had any business holding. Every neighboring male within a day's walk had heard the roars of the final fight, and the savannah had adjusted its behavior in response. Prey animals had learned to stay away from the center of the range. Rival coalitions had rerouted their patrols to avoid the boundaries. The 4 had not just taken territory, they had changed the way the entire region moved. The 5th territory presented itself almost as an afterthought. It lay on the far side of their range, a smaller piece of ground held by a weakened male who had been watching the 4 expand for months. He knew what was coming. When the 4 arrived, he did not come out to meet them. He left, quietly, in the night, and the 4 walked into an empty territory without a single fight. The 5th territory was not taken. It was surrendered before the 4 arrived. Subscribe to receive the next entries in this record. What follows is the holding of what was won. If the weaker male's quiet departure stayed with you, leave one word in the comments. Absence. 5 territories. The title of this record was fulfilled by an act of absence, by a male who had read the arithmetic of 4 and decided that the cost was not worth paying. The savannah held its breath, and the 4 stood at the center of the largest empire their region had ever seen. This is where the observer must pause, because this is where the story changes. The conquest had been remarkable, but the holding of it would prove to be a different kind of test. 4 brothers had broken the territorial order of the savannah. The question was whether they could survive what they had built. 2 brothers patrolled the northern boundary. 2 held the south. The center, the water point that had been the hub of their growing range, now sat empty of males for the first time in months. The 4 had split permanently into pairs, and the old unity of the single unit had itself become a casualty of the empire they had created. The savannah did not wait long to exploit the gap. Rival coalitions, driven out months before, began to test the boundaries. Hyenas, emboldened by the absence of males, moved closer to the prides. The old male from the first territory, or another male who had inherited his border, began to appear at the edge of the range, probing, watching, waiting. The 4 responded as they always had, as one animal with 4 points of attention. But the points were spread too thin now. When a threat appeared on the northern boundary, the 2 brothers there could not summon the other 2 quickly enough. The response was always late, always costly, and the cracks in the empire widened with every passing season. The 3rd year ended as it had begun, with the 4 standing at the center of their range. But the standing had a different quality now. The muscles were still there. The scars still mapped their faces, but the rest between patrols had grown longer, and the distance between the pairs had grown shorter. The 4 were drawing inward, consolidating, giving up ground they could no longer hold. 5 territories, 3 years, 1 empire. The savannah records the triumph and the cost in the same breath, and the grass remembers both. The 4 brothers broke the old order, and in breaking it, they learned the oldest lesson the savannah has to teach, that the ground you hold is never finished demanding what it costs. The 4th brother, the one who had carried the gash from the 4th territory, no longer patrolled the far boundaries. He stayed closer to the center now, nearer the water, and the other 3 adjusted their routes around the new geometry of his limitations. The empire was still theirs. The record still stands. but the holding of it had become the hardest thing any of them had ever done. The Savannah does not offer a clean ending, and this record will not offer one either. The four brothers remain, at the close of the 3 years, standing over the largest range their region has ever seen. The cost is written on their bodies, the unity still absolute, the disciplines of patrol and scent and silence still holding the map together. What comes next is not written. The grass will record it, and the grass records without judgment. 4 brothers, 5 territories, 3 years. The great-granddaughters of the cubs they fathered will inherit the ground they won, and the sons of the males they drove out will return to test the boundaries again when the brothers age and weaken. That is the oldest arithmetic of the Savannah, older than any empire, older than any coalition. What is taken is held for a time, and then it is taken again. The 4 knew this, and they did not care. They were 4. That was enough. The old male who had fled the 5th territory without a fight did not vanish entirely from the record. He drifted along the margins, keeping just beyond the scent lines the 4 had laid, and observers noted something that complicated the simple story of conquest. He was not the only one. Dispersed males from the displaced prides gathered in the unclaimed ground between territories, forming loose associations of their own, and the Savannah began to shift around the new geometry. These gatherings had a logic that the 4 understood better than anyone. A single male driven from his pride rarely survives the first season alone. He cannot hunt large prey efficiently by himself. He carries wounds that need time to heal, and he has no allies to watch his back while he sleeps. But 2 such males, or 3, meeting in the margins, can become something almost like a coalition. The 4 had created the conditions for these pairings simply by displacing so many rivals at once. The irony was not lost on the observers who had watched the entire campaign. The brothers had removed the old order to build their empire, and in doing so, they had seeded the ground with the very thing that would eventually challenge them. The displaced males were not allies. They did not coordinate, but they were numerous, and they were patient, and they had nothing left to lose. This is the part of the record that resists a clean narrative. The 4 did not face a single great rival in their 3rd year. They faced a dozen small threats, each one manageable on its own, each one draining a little more from the brothers who had to respond. A coalition of 2 testing the northern boundary 1 week. A trio of displaced males probing the southern edge the next. The 4 could drive any of them off, and they did. But every response cost them rest, and every lost hour of rest made the next response slower. The observers began to time the patrols. In the 1st year, a boundary violation drew a response within hours. In the 3rd year, the response took a full day, sometimes longer. The 4 were not slower in any physical sense. They were spread thinner, and the distance between the pairs had become a tactical weakness that every rival in the region was learning to exploit. One morning, the observers recorded a moment that seemed to summarize the entire campaign in a single image. The 4th brother, the one with the gash from the 4th territory, stood alone at the water point, while the other 3 were scattered across the range. He was not patrolling. He was not hunting. He was simply standing, head low, breathing slowly, and the grass around him was absolutely still. It was the stillness of an animal that had learned to hold an entire empire in the space of its own exhaustion. The Savannah is not a place of permanent victory. It is a place of temporary arrangements, and the arrangements are always being renegotiated. The 4 had negotiated the most advantageous arrangement of their lives, but the negotiation was not over. It never is. The grass does not care who won the last fight. It only records who is standing at the edge of the next one. By the end of the 3rd year, the observers noticed a subtle change in the 4's behavior. They had stopped expanding. They had even given up some ground on the edges of their range, ground that would have been unthinkable to surrender in the 1st year. The 5th territory, the one taken without a fight, was the first to go. It was simply too far from the center, too costly to patrol, and the 4 had made the quiet calculation that the empire's edge was not worth the energy required to hold it. This was not defeat. It was arithmetic of a different kind, the arithmetic of sustainability, and it was the first sign that the 4 understood something that most coalitions never grasp. The goal was not to hold the largest possible territory. The goal was to hold a territory that could actually be defended. The 4 had learned this lesson in the only way the Savannah teaches it, by losing something they had bled to gain. The brothers remained 4. That was the constant that ran through every change, every retreat, every recalculation. The unity that had carried them through the first territory still held at the end of the 3rd year. They rested more now, and they moved less, but they still moved as one. The observers who had watched them from the beginning noted that the coordination had not faded. If anything, it had deepened, refined by years of practice into a kind of wordless precision that no coalition of two could ever match. The scars told the story of the years as clearly as the territory map. Each brother carried a different record of the campaign, a different geography of wound and healing. The first brother, the one who had always led the encirclements, bore the marks of close combat on his forelegs. The second had a torn ear from the fight at the 4th territory. The third showed the thickened skin of the brow that comes from years of impact. And the fourth, the one who now stayed closest to the water, carried the deepest map of them all, the gash from the 4th territory, still a visible line through his fur. The pride dynamics had shifted in ways the observers had not anticipated. The females, who had watched 4 strangers take over their prides, had developed their own strategies for managing the new males. They synchronized their cycles, presented themselves to the brothers in sequence, and the cubs that followed carried the blood of all 4, spread across all 5 territories. The females synchronized their cycles, and the cubs carried the blood of all 4 across all 5 territories. That was not a break in the record. That was the record deepening. Subscribe to receive the next entries as the 4's genetic legacy is documented. Leave the word synchrony in the comments to mark the female's response. The genetic record of the region was being rewritten in a single generation. Every litter born under the 4's tenure carried a mixture of the brothers' traits, and the observers noted that the cubs were larger on average than those sired by single males. The 4's cooperation had extended beyond territory and patrol into the very biology of the next generation. The displaced males, meanwhile, had not given up. The loose associations they had formed in the margins were hardening into something more structured. 2 of them, a pair that had been driven from the 2nd territory, had begun to test the southern boundary with increasing boldness. They came closer each week, learning the patrol schedules, waiting for the moment when the 4's attention was divided. The 4 responded not with aggression, but with calculation. They did not chase the pair deep into the margins, knowing that chasing left the center undefended. Instead, they laid fresh scent marks along the contested boundary, a clear message written in urine and gland oil that the pair read without needing to see the brothers themselves. This was the subtle warfare of the savannah, conducted in smells and sounds, rather than in clashes of tooth and claw. The 4 had become masters of it, and the observers realized that the empire was held as much by chemistry as by combat. Every boundary was a statement, every scent marked a sentence in a language that every lion in the region understood perfectly. The pair on the southern boundary did not retreat. They held their ground just beyond the scent line, waiting, and the standoff settled into a kind of equilibrium. Neither side attacked, neither side yielded. The grass between them grew tall and undisturbed, and the observers began to call it the quiet boundary, the one place on the map where the campaign had paused. The 4th brother's limp had become a permanent feature of his movement by the middle of the 3rd year. He did not favor the leg in the way that a young animal favors a fresh injury. He moved with an older accommodation, a settled acceptance of limitation that showed in the way he chose his paths. He walked the flatter ground now, avoided the steep banks of the dry riverbeds, and the other 3 adjusted without ever seeming to discuss it. The observers watched one evening as the 4 made their way to the water point together. The 4th brother moved ahead, picking a route along the easiest ground, and the other 3 followed his path rather than their own. It was a small thing, a preference granted without words, but it told the observers more about the unity of the 4 than any fight ever had. The unity had a cost, and the cost was visible in the way the first brother now carried extra weight. He had always been the largest, the one who led the encirclements, but the constant eating of the first years had given way to a slower metabolism. He rested more now, and the observers noticed that he was the one who usually lay at the center of the resting group, the position of greatest safety and least vigilance. The hierarchy of the 4 had never been aggressive. There were no dominance fights, no displays of authority, no teeth bared in challenge. The hierarchy was a matter of function, of who did what best, and it had stabilized so completely that the observers could predict with confidence which brother would move first at any disturbance. The first brother rose first. The fourth brother rose last. The prey animals of the region had adapted to the four's presence in ways that surprised the observers. The herds had learned to avoid the center of the range, but they had also learned something more subtle. They knew when the four were hunting as a unit and when they were hunting in pairs, and they adjusted their behavior accordingly. The four had become a weather system, and the animals read their movements like a forecast. Predators had adapted as well. The hyena clans had grown bolder in the absence of consistent male presence at the edges of the range. They did not challenge the four directly, but they shadowed the prides, waiting for the moment when a kill was made, and the brothers were occupied with feeding. The scavengers had become an economy of their own, living off the margins of the empire the four had built. The observers had begun to keep a different kind of record as the third year wore on. They noted not the fights and the territories, but the small moments of coordination that had become the four's signature. A shared glance before a decision. A low call answered from 100 yards away. The way the four entered a clearing in a precise sequence, each brother covering a different angle of approach. These were the mechanics of unity, and they were more impressive than any single battle. The four had not simply learned to fight together. They had learned to think together, to move as a single organism across a landscape too large for any one animal to dominate. The empire was not a collection of territories. It was a single living thing, and it moved.